This more elusive yet essential issue of the cosmology was very much to do with God, or how God organized the creation, and we are a small part of it.
I think that's the keynote, that we're a small part of it. We are a small part of an enormous whole, a much bigger whole. This idea from the fourth way that we as human beings on the surface of the earth, in a solar system, in a galaxy, in the universe, that we are connected. Everything's connected, in other words. That's one of the principal ideas of this cosmology. Yes, stemming from the creator, whatever that is. Our minds aren't capable of understanding that whole concept. It's simplified very much by science in the form of the Big Bang. But that is far from answering a multitude of questions about reality, about creation, about existence, and all that. This idea that we are a tiny cog, we take it so much for granted that we are human beings, that we're in this human form. This is just another form in all of creation. We know many other forms on the surface of the earth: the mineral world, the animal world, the vegetable world, the clouds, the oceans. We have an idea of the planet. We can't even with our naked eye really see another planet. But with the aid of telescopes and other equipment and cameras that have actually flown by these planets, amazing, we're able to see them, but they're just other forms, and this human being is just another form. And it's so automatic for us to be human, to have limbs, to have a head, to be able to talk like this and communicate fairly intelligently about ideas. This is an unusual thing. And the fourth way says all of these influences are passing up and down this chain from higher worlds to lower worlds. And a key component in our solar system is the Earth. It's the only planet that we know of in our solar system that has this thin strip of life around on the surface of it, just on the very thin surface. We forget even that we're on this enormous rock that may have some kind of thermal center and is a form all of its own, which is mysterious and unknown to us in so many ways. Then here we are as part of this thin strip of organic life. And this is not an accident. That's what the cosmology is saying. This is all by design, so that these influences can come from the galaxy to the sun, throughout its solar system and planets, and reach the Earth and the moon. And that this so-called device of organic life on Earth is intended to be there for the purpose of enabling certain fine transmissions to pass through the solar system from the sun and planets to the moon. That this is part and parcel of the whole galaxy, and that human beings within this organic life on Earth are the most sophisticated mechanism or sophisticated device within the larger mechanism of organic life on Earth. And this, we take it so for granted that we have movement, sensation, thought, and emotion. What the fourth way says is these are all sort of channels for receiving influences coming from the sun and from the planets. These influences affect us. They manifest in us as human beings in the form of thoughts, emotions, sensations, movements. Then people are busy about their lives and don't understand that in doing so, in just being busy being a human, we are playing our part as a tiny cog in this big mechanism. And the same goes for when we talk about trying to wake up or become enlightened or be present or be more aware, realize awareness, and all these things. This is also not an accident. This also has some kind of purpose. It's related to, it's much more than about just you or me trying to reach bliss or experience a state of love all the time. There's much more than that. It's much bigger than that. That can be wonderful, but what's that got to do with the rest of it, with the big picture, as we're calling this, the bigger picture? That's why I feel it is helpful for us to revisit this subject, flesh it out as much as we can. People can go to Gurdjieff and Ouspensky's books and read about these concepts. I think it's very useful for us to blow some fresh air into these sails around this idea of cosmology. It's powerful. As I said last time, it can be so refreshing to get out of our little life and our little psychology and even our little, what can sometimes be a selfish or singular effort to wake up and see it's part of something much bigger. What might that be? For example, what happens if you do wake up? There are other many higher dimensions than this dimension. And this idea of consciousness ascending through this ray of creation, not just descending. It's one of the few ascending octaves, as the fourth way says, in the ray of creation. And this has a lot of depth to it. And these tools of the cosmology, they give the mind a handle by which it can try to understand how consciousness perceives reality. But ultimately, what we're talking about when it comes to cosmology is it's a language that only awareness, consciousness itself knows. With the help of these ideas, mentally, we can climb up to the edge of the next higher dimension where awareness realizes itself. It's useful that our mind can play a part in this. Often the mind is dismissed. At the same time, it's part of the design of this human being to be able to be given this knowledge and use this knowledge as a trampoline almost for awareness to jump out of the room.
Well, what sparks in me is I started actually reading this book that I never read before from Ouspensky called The New Model of the Universe. He's dealing with the bigger picture there. He's not going into the psychology, but the cosmology, the esoteric history of humanity. I was listening to it and I could sense that although the science of his time 100 years ago was very different than our science now, but he was alluding to is that it seems like to be in the design of the human being, only the human being with it having the most sophisticated nervous system and having an additional function besides the moving center, instinctive center, emotional center, sex center. There is the intellectual center with the ability of abstract thought. Somehow having an extra function, this allows us the possibility of the human being is like a self-evolving, has the possibility of self-evolving. Whereas the other creatures, they don't have that. And somehow it is a design of the architect that there is this possibility in humans. So it is a design of the architect that large part of the humanity is unconscious and living in some mass illusion, mass hypnosis, mass hysteria. It's not a mistake. It's not bad. Somehow it is needed in this way. And also it is designed by the architect that some people can rise above it. So maybe we can touch on that, on this idea that the different, depends on the level of consciousness we are at, we are under different operating influences. Even an enlightened master is influenced by certain things. It's just that the type of influence is different. And it seems like the process of evolution, we are changing the influences we put ourselves under.
Let's call it the universe as we know it, has a physical aspect to it, like a physical body. And it has a conscious aspect to it, consciousness. We as human beings parallel this. We have a physiology. And even our psychology is tied to our physiology in many ways. But we also have this consciousness aspect. And it's as though and this is what makes the human being rare. The human being is like a container of a certain kind in which awareness can realize itself, in which and through which. The container isn't conscious. The container doesn't become more conscious. Consciousness becomes more self-aware. Consciousness becomes more aware as being itself, as being, as the being, this beingness of consciousness or awareness. The universe in general is serving what the fourth way calls serving mechanical purposes. This has to do largely with the physical side of the universe. And then there's this conscious purpose it also serves, and it needs to serve both. Some consciousness has to realize itself and rise up through this thing called the ray of creation. And for example, you mentioned suffering a moment ago. The fourth way is so simple and frank and cuts right through this idea of suffering, that suffering is part of life on earth. All forms of living matter of form, living forms of creation, all of them suffer. And of course, ultimately, all of them die, what's called dying, which means the disintegration of their physical form. But in their physical form, they all suffer. And this, according to the cosmology of the fourth way, is because the earth is in such a unique place. It's in such a place within this ray of creation. It's considered that it's the equivalent of the stomach of the solar system. Influences coming from above are being digested and then passed on to the moon, is the idea. It sounds kind of crude and crazy. I mean, when you first hear this idea, maybe. And the idea is that suffering is meant to happen to everyone. And the idea is not that we cannot escape suffering, but consciousness need not be attached to and identified with the suffering when it happens. Through this process, consciousness itself can be transformed and realize itself. Whereas most of the time, consciousness is being sucked down into all that we experience as a human being. And it attaches to and identifies as a feeling of I, as a feeling of my body, my emotions, my thoughts, my life, my problems, my suffering. And by virtue of that, we serve en masse this functioning of this ray of creation in such a way as for the higher to feed the lower, for the higher to descend from rarefied form into more dense form, from formlessness into form. And it's almost like an exhalation. This is where I think this idea in the East comes from of breathing in and breathing out. The universe is breathing in and breathing out. And in a sense, it's breathing consciousness out and breathing consciousness back in. These are big truths that we normally don't think about. We just think, I have my life. I can do what I want. I can make this happen if I want. I can make that happen. I don't need to suffer. I can just be happy. None of that's true. We are these little cogs and things happen. The moon gets full and we start to have more bizarre thoughts. The solar flares erupt and they send plasma through space. And it takes, I think the plasma takes a couple of days to reach the Earth and affect the magnetic field of the Earth in dramatic ways. And we're these little tiny little things inside. We're like little pieces of the receiving mechanism. And we are very much affected by this in our thoughts and emotions and our physical. Sometimes you might feel a little tension or a little heat or a little weird. And then the solar flares themselves only take a few minutes. I think it's 8 minutes, according to science. When there's a flare, a burst of light coming from the sun, what's called a solar flare, and there's that, like the light got turned up, that light coming is carrying more than just light to the Earth. And then the plasma is when there's physical material from the sun in the form of particles are actually almost spit out, not just at the Earth, but into the solar system, and some of it happens to just reach Earth. And we're close to the sun. Jupiter, Saturn, much farther away. Mercury, Mars, Venus, and Earth, pretty close relative to Jupiter and Saturn. We live a life as human beings, what the fourth way calls mechanical and asleep, meaning consciousness is not realizing itself as consciousness, but we have this capacity. The animals don't have this. The trees don't have this. The rocks don't have this. The clouds, the oceans, they don't have this. They've been created, they're a manifestation of form also, but they don't have this built-in capacity to be aware of their own existence. And for that awareness of their existence to realize itself as awareness. And that is why human life, from one point of view, is so sacred, so profound, so seemingly rare in the universe. We don't understand what it means that we have found ourselves here in human form on the surface of the Earth with this capacity to be more and more conscious of the fact that we exist as a human being, of the fact that we exist on the surface of a planet in a solar system. And another thing is this idea of the ray of creation, the cosmology, why it can be so powerful is that the idea is there are these layers of worlds within worlds that make up this ray of creation. And each world is under more laws. When you go from higher, finer, denser, slower matter, there are more and more laws that you're under. It's like being under more weight. And this is true of us personally. We are under more laws, for example, when we are fully invested in negative emotions. We're under a lot of laws, psychological laws and physical laws when that's happening. And we can be free from that law. We're under many laws that we don't even realize, but when you start to observe it, you can feel it. When we're in imagination, this is a psychological law that human beings are under. The planets aren't in imagination. That's not a property of the laws that the planets are influenced by. But human beings on Earth have this. And then what's called identification, where our consciousness is always lapsing into what it is conscious of. We just see something and we immediately, our awareness goes into it, doesn't retain recognition as itself seeing what is being seen, hearing what is being heard. They collapse into each other and without conscious awareness. We don't have to be under the laws of negative emotions or imagination or identification. And these are three enormous laws specific to human beings. The Earth is under its own laws, the planets are under their own laws, the sun. But each world, as you go higher, theoretically, according to the fourth way cosmology, is under fewer and fewer laws. What does this mean theoretically, at least? It means when we escape from these laws, these lower laws in ourselves, we begin to be under the influence of only the laws that the planets are under, or only the laws that the sun is under. Now, this speaks to our consciousness. That means our consciousness is under fewer and fewer and fewer laws. Our physical body remains a physical body on planet Earth, the form of human being, still will suffer, still will feel pain, still will feel effects of the full moon, will still feel the effects of a solar flare.
My mind, as I'm hearing this, I'm like, okay, well, how can we make this practical? How can our viewers make this practical? But I can see that if one is at the level of consciousness that one's head is less filled with what would they think of me and trying to be seen and this law of inner considering, and they didn't treat me right, and all the stuff that happened that I'm suffering, and all the stuff that will happen and I'm suffering. Yeah, as the psychology is more settled down and we are more quiet mind, less tortured energy in the body, then we have the bandwidth to look up. And even contemplating on these thoughts, even talking about, raises basically increases the level of relativity. So we are escaping this little box of human-centric universe. And that is a step in the right direction.
And in fact, when you look at the fourth way, the way Gurdjieff and Ouspensky present it, they talk about obstacles to awakening, obstacles to self-remembering. And one way you can see what these obstacles are is what we're talking about. They are laws. Mm-hmm. They're each a kind of a law peculiar to human beings that keep consciousness asleep, keep consciousness attached to the body and mind, to the force centers, to the feeling of I. And I would say the basic three are identification, imagination, and negative emotions. The other obstacles are related to those three in some manner. Three laws, according to the fourth way, that are the principal things keeping consciousness bound. If we free ourselves from these, we can learn, instead of being transformed by our suffering in such a way as to serve the planetary purposes of the ray of creation, we instead can use suffering to transform consciousness. Suffering becomes a catalyst, and it becomes a main catalyst for human beings. This suffering thing, we don't understand suffering either, and as human beings, we mistake it as something bad, for example. And we think, I did bad, I'm sorry, what's wrong? All these kind of things. No, suffering is Ouspensky called it a kind of fermentation. If organic life on Earth, all this life forms on the surface of the Earth, if they are equivalent to the stomach of the solar system, this is where the digestion is happening, the digestive juices, and there's a fermentation going on. Things are being turned into other things. And then there's waste product too.
It struck me what you said here about that this dimension of this Earth like a stomach of the solar system, and I hear this in other teachings too, that although it is a maximum opportunity to be embodied here, as spirit with a body, they also say that, hey, this is they call it like a dog-eat-dog world. And Ouspensky called it that here on the earth is a pain factory. Basically, everything is eating something else and is being eaten by something else. And there is this divine harmony of earth maintaining, but is based on something is eating and is being eaten by something else. So that shows that at the physical form, that is not a place of rest and a place of joy and peace, definitely not lasting. Everything is the kingdom of heaven, but in this dimension of the physical and separation, it is like a pain factory. Like it is actually to be in this earth. It's a lot of suffering. Even one has cleared the unnecessary suffering and the suffering that is coming from the sense of separation and for going against the law. Basically, there's a lot of suffering through forgetting the law that all is one and thinking that I'm a rogue, self-serving, independent thing. Even if you clear all of this and you don't have to suffer with the tortures of the mind and of the tortures of the emotions and the illusions, still there is some inescapable suffering, basically this impermanence. Everything that we love is going to die. Everything we're going to lose, everything we love, and including this body and our kids and our parents and loved ones and the pets. There cannot be stability and safety at the level of form. So it's not that, okay, now I do this, meditate, and I reach a level and I'm groovy and I'm free of suffering and it's perfect bliss all the time. Doesn't seem to be the case. But just a little bit more, Peter, here. I find a practical thread here, what you said with this freeing ourselves from the dense laws of unconsciousness, and the obstacles are density of consciousness, unconsciousness kind of ruling our life. One can spend the whole life of getting credibility or getting respect or not getting it, and it is possible to be done with it. So we don't have to worry about it. We are freer from this law of trying to please, trying to be good, trying to be seen in a certain way, all this inner considering. Also, the law of imagination. Basically, most people are, there's no quiet space of being. It's all the time the radio in the head. And this radio in the head broadcasts the unconscious psychology. When one is in imagination, one is not available to the beauty, to the sunset, to the miracle. So one is unavailable to the kingdom of heaven because one is stuck in the box with the radio.
And we can feel these things. The more we attune ourselves to them consciously, we can feel the psychological weight, for example, of negative emotions. And we can feel when we are free of that weight. And the same with imagination, it's no accident. We often call it the cloud of imagination, because it's as though we're in a cloud. It's like the atmosphere around the earth. And in fact, there's a parallel between the human person, their mind and their imagination working. It parallels the atmosphere surrounding the earth. It is like a cloud, it's like an atmosphere, this imagination. And we're in it, and then we pop out. We're no longer bound by that cloud. We're now out of the atmosphere of our psychology, and we're into space. There's a direct parallel there. And then going toward the sun, to the source of consciousness. And these are parallels, and this exists in us. And we can feel it when we're less identified. We can feel it when we're less in imagination. We can feel it when we're less negative. You mentioned inner considering also, this idea of worrying about what other people, how we imagine we are being perceived and how that churns in us psychologically. And we can feel when we are less under these laws. You can even feel it sometimes when you step out of a certain environment. Like some people have a very difficult job, intense jobs, and they're identified, and they may even be negative. And then they step away from that, and their identification diminishes. Their negativity diminishes. They feel lighter. They feel happy. Happiness, by the way, genuine happiness, genuine joy, genuine love, these are the result of being under less laws. And now we're under these higher laws. Because you could say that even the feeling of love and the feeling of joy are still under some kind of law. It is also possible to rise above those. Consciousness can rise even above those, be under even less laws, and be closer to its origin, its source, its highest potential. How high does this potential exist for us in the ray of creation?
It is said that the level of false personality, the level of when consciousness is in the setting of self-forgetfulness, and it is at the level of being the ego, it's under 96 laws. 96 laws. It's almost like 96 things that you have to worry about, you have to fulfill, you have to please, all these 96 things. You have to do it. And the level of our essence, like when you see a child that's born and for a few years before they get contaminated with a lot of conditioning, the level of our what's called essence in the fourth way or authentic nature, that is under 24 laws. That's world 24. And that's why we love children, because they are so freer and they have less worries and they are much happier. Therefore, they don't have to please 96 masters and check 96 boxes. However, you see, we lose that kind of lightness of being, spontaneity, creativity, and then, due to various factors like wrong education, is educated by people who are asleep. We are getting denser and denser. And that's why when we go in nature, just by spending some time in nature, if you don't bring your boombox and you don't not on the phone, that will inadvertently bring you to another lighter dimension in oneself. Somebody asks us, well, so we free ourselves from certain laws, like unnecessarily worrying about what other people think of us, or thinking a lot about what happened, hoping that we did something else, and blaming ourselves that we did that, or interpreting a certain past situation as there's not fair and I'm a victim. All of these are laws that bring suffering, and they are self-maintained. So this can be freed, and then still we are under some laws. Basically, we need air, the temperature needs to be at a certain thing, we need water, and we need food. So there are still these things, but all the other unnecessary suffering, self-created, that is optional. And here we come to the topic of suffering. Everybody suffers here, but very few. Most people suffer without any grain of results. There's no profit.
I was just thinking, a good example, the politics are at a high tension in this country right now. There's going to be even more heightening of tension and animosity and even hatred. And this tension is going to rise up and through this election. And many people, they will lose themselves through identification with what's happening. There will be this tension, but instead of giving way to it by identifying with it over much and being in lots of imagination about it, and then having lots of negative emotions, where you're disagreeing violently with other people and you're having animosity and vitriol toward candidates and all these things. See, all of that's just falling into this mechanism of being a human being on earth, as opposed to just seeing what's happening, watching what's happening, and not investing identity into it. It doesn't mean you don't care. It means you don't lose yourself. You don't let your identity chew on all this stuff. This is a practical example for many people. It's no accident it's happening, as I mentioned, about solar flares. And when there's a little more tension in your day or in your life or with you between other people, to see it but not fall headfirst into it. Become identified with it, become negative about it, express negativity about it. This doesn't mean act like everything's okay. It means see things as they are. and be conscious of them as they are without attaching as a sense of identity in relation to them, as though my identity is now invested in this, in the heat, or in the ache in my back, or in the election, or in the war, or in some controversy that happened at work today, or a disagreement I had with someone. Do you just see those things as they are? These idea of these laws that we're under, and it shows you how difficult it is to escape from these laws. These are big, big, big laws that we are under, that we're talking about. And this thing about being more conscious and more awake and escaping from these laws is a very subtle, it's like a tiny little needle slipping through this huge mass of material, finding a little hole, and just slipping through unnoticed. And that's the thing, consciousness slips through to a higher dimension of awareness as itself. It slips through unnoticed. It's an internal transformation that is silent, wordless, motionless. It's a beingness of presence that recognizes it's not collapsing into all the pull of all this imagination, identification, negativity. And you feel it, it's a lighter, more radiant, more vibrant realization of being. But at the same time, related to this and related to suffering, we take for granted the sunlight coming from the sun. We fail to recognize the light of the sun is the result of heat. It's not just light beaming out. It's a manifestation of heat. And this heat is so powerful, so dynamic on the sun. You could almost say the sun's body is comprised of a multitude of nuclear bombs. It's exploding all the time. And it's generating this incredible heat. And this incredible heat is generating this life-sustaining light. We can feel it as heat too. You don't even see light. You see it reflected in objects. And if you do turn around and try to look at the sun, you don't actually see its light. You do in a way, but it's also interesting. Rodney Collin pointed this out. You can't look at the sun for very long. And he said it's because as a human being, the human being is not designed to look into the next higher dimension. We cannot look into that dimension. We don't have the tools for it, the capacity. But consciousness, awareness inside does. It doesn't mean it can look at the sun. It means it can perceive into that higher world because it is in that higher world. But suffering in our lives is the result of friction. This friction creates heat, which we experience as suffering. And then awakening refers to, and transformation of suffering refers to using that to heighten consciousness, rather than that defeating consciousness and us then feeling sorry for ourselves, wishing it wasn't happening, feeling that it's not justified, wishing it would go away, that it's bad, all these things. This is the collapse of consciousness.
One last idea I want to touch upon. The human as a species, as an experiment, is a creation experiment. The human being, we say that it is the most sophisticated and the most complex life form. And this is known in terms of creatures and animals, that the nervous system and the brain is the most complex and the most sophisticated nervous system. And then we talked about the fact that we have one additional function. We have the intellect. So somehow we say, well, okay, we are more complex and more developed, perfected machinery for the possibility of self-consciousness, for the possibility of the presence to realize itself. Somehow it needs the dimension of the intellect. In spite of that, this human being can be worse than like a very primitive animal and is responsible, so such a sophisticated machinery is responsible for ruining the ecosystem and the well-being of the planet, and can be seen that humanity, or part of humanity, could be seen as a cancer at the level of the earth.
And the fourth way it explains that, in fact, that is all part of the design. In fact, that human beings are in harmony with the whole, even though consciousness is asleep. But this extra capacity you're talking about enables consciousness to move in another direction, to ascend. But in fact, people going to war, people killing each other, people having psychotic episodes, they are actually in harmony with this big design of what organic life on Earth, which includes humanity as only one part of it, is doing its job perfectly, which is these juices in the stomach, this digestive process happening in the solar system. And what seems like a cancer, us somehow being cancerous to nature, it's exactly what is supposed to happen. When you mentioned the intellect, what I recalled in my mind is that you could look at the intellectual center as the one center in us that, and sometimes it's compared to a mirror. The intellectual center as a mirror can reflect awareness back to itself. It would be as though the sun is shining, it's reflecting off the earth, and that reflection is coming back to the sun. And the sun now realizes it's the sun. Prior to that, it had been beaming itself, its light onto the earth, and it became, as it were, preoccupied, identified with the earth, and even thought itself to be the earth, a feeling of I in earth. But this intellectual center, being as this mirror, it can reflect the light back. And then awareness through that process can realize itself. And it's no accident that knowledge, for example, knowledge about these processes of awakening and enlightenment and so on that existed for millennia, is a thing for the intellectual center. It's all part of this mirror, and it's actually awareness reflecting itself and then being reflected back through this mirror and cognizing itself as the source of the light. And this is this special thing we have as human beings. And somehow at our place in the universe, and this goes back to the cosmology, Spensky said we need to study our place in the universe. This isn't just about us wanting to be happy, or no, it isn't just about us. Somehow this design at this place in the ray of creation, in the universe, exists in such a way that awareness can realize itself. Almost it seems to me as though to breathe back into itself. It has been breathed out into all this form. We're at the very bottom almost of the ray of creation. Somehow now it can go back. It has to realize itself. In fact, this is the idea of the alpha and the omega, the absolute and the moon in this whole ray of creation. The absolute exists at the very top and at the bottom. It is the whole thing, but those are the 2 points you could say where it can realize itself.
Yeah, that's interesting that in the second state, waking sleep and self-forgetfulness and sense of separation, there is this sense of lack and meaninglessness, antsiness, and something is not quite right. It's interesting that nature or God implanted this device in us when we are going against the law, the truth of what is here. We feel that something is not right, and then we are going back on track. We feel that things are right.
And it's true that there is something wrong. And it is that awareness is not cognizant as itself. And you could almost say that awareness is almost sending a signal to itself in the human being. My life doesn't feel right. I'm not satisfied. When this happens to you, you can almost use it as a wake-up call, literally, that awareness is trying to send a signal, a message, that it's not fully cognizant as itself. We even experience the desire to want to find ourselves, the desire to want to be our true self. All these, you can also view these as impulses that are the result of some kind of signal, something coming out from awareness itself to recognize itself. And in this way, we are this temple. We are the body and mind of we are this servant, this vehicle, all for the purpose of the self-consciousness of awareness. Some say this is the highest game being played. Awareness is playing this game with itself. And we are part of that. We're part of the chessboard. We're part of the pieces on the game. But the game is really being played from a higher dimension.
If you are new to this is meant to open the mind of the seeker, of the practitioner. And in this way, all the psychological work, somatic processing work, mindfulness, meditation, self-remembering, all of this, very often it stays at this level of the ego, basically. Ego trying to have it a little bit better, ego to be a little more expanded. in the fourth way point of view, there is this work of bringing awareness and knowing oneself and letting go of weaknesses and mechanical tendencies, but all to diminish the veils and the ignorance, so we can see who we are and all that is, and we can be more aligned to the architect. We are more really aligned with trying to understand more what our real father, mother, our creator, be helpful to our creator if possible.
There's a line, a thought I had many years ago, which I still use for myself, and in this sense I think it applies, and that is, on a clear day or on a clear night, step outside and look up at the vast universe and do this. Notice yourself noticing the universe, noticing you, noticing it. Notice yourself noticing the universe, noticing you, notice it. Our consciousness is wanting to, you could say, that isn't even the right word, is inclined to aligning itself with its source. And somehow it knows the way home to this source. And it's through more and more presence, more and more awareness, consciousness, both of things and of itself as itself. Both of these can become more vibrant, more clear, more mysterious, more wondrous, and more telling. Notice yourself noticing the universe, noticing you, noticing it. This requires more than thought.